Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, literature, and popular culture. Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Markison. As always, I'm joined by co-host and producer Tracy Asteria. Tracy, what's going on?
Not too much, Bruce. It's a long weekend here in Nova Scotia, so I'm taking in a little bit of the good weather and, putting my feet up and relaxing a little bit. How's everything with you?
Well, it's good. I'm excited. This is our 40th episode that we are doing. We started almost a year ago, June of 2023. And by the time 1 year has elapsed, we should be somewhere in the area of about 43, 44 episodes. Of course, when we started, we only did every other week. We did that for like 3 months. And then in the fall, we made the daring switch to once a week, which has worked out very well. So we're at 40 shows, which is pretty darn cool to be there. A lot of podcasts, they give up after a little while. We're stubborn here. We're going to keep going, right?
Absolutely. This is always a blast. And, you get to learn so many different things about some of the guests that we've had on the show. And from my standpoint, I learned so much from you. So I think this is a great venture.
Well, I've learned a lot from the guests, and I've learned a little bit of sci-fi from you as well, which has been good. So this week, Tracy, we are going to, between the two of us, break down two films. One is an example of vintage horror from the mid-1960s, a pretty famous film called The Masque of the Red Death, directed by the legendary Roger Corman. And the other is a new film that just came out this spring. It's a vampire movie called simply Abigail. They are two very different films from different eras. They really don't have any connection to each other than the fact that they're both appropriate and timely to talk about right now, although for different reasons. Now, as you know, Tracy, earlier this month, the world of horror lost one of its most legendary figures, the prolific producer and director Roger Corman. He passed away at the age of 98. Amazing life and career. He served as a producer of an astonishing 493 films. I don't know if that's a record. It's got to be close to it. So almost 500 films in which he was either an executive producer or one of the producers. Took risks on a lot of the films, but it obviously worked out long-term for him. More hits than misses. And then if you look at those films, many of them did fall into the category of horror and sci-fi, which obviously creates a connection to what we do here. In addition, Corman directed 56 films and includes some real classics from the 1950s and 60s. You had A Bucket of Blood, The House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, and The Terror, among others. So an amazing career as a producer and as a director. Of all the films that he directed, probably my favorite is the 1964 release, The Masque of the Red Death. And as of June of this year, the film will mark its 60th anniversary. So it's a milestone for the film, as well as, I think, being representative of what Corman did at his very best. Now, Corman, back in the 1960s, made a series of pictures for American International Pictures, and these were based on the writings of Edgar Allan Poe. Many of them were very loose adaptations because a lot of the Poe stories are short stories that don't necessarily translate into a feature-length film. So Corman and others who have adapted Poe's work really have had to make a lot of changes, very loose adaptations in order to create something that's going to work on the screen for, an hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever the length might be. Masque of the Red Death, in my mind, is probably the best of those Poe adaptations that Roger Corman did. Like most of Corman's films, he uses a lot of creativity and ingenuity to make the most out of a small budget. It seemed like he never had much money to work with. And also, very smartly, he relied heavily here on the talents of his star of the Masque of the Red Death, and that's the great Vincent Price. So you got Vincent Price in your corner, even if you don't have a lot of money and you don't have necessarily elaborate outdoor sets to work with, you got Price, and that's a pretty good head start. So Vincent Price stars as the evil and greedy Prince Prospero. He lives on a castle, or in a castle on a hill above the poor European village of Catania. This is sometime during the Middle Ages. The village is being ravaged by a plague, the so-called Red Death, that's making its way across the countryside. The evil prince rules over the local villagers with lots of anger and contempt, and that doesn't change during a crisis. While the villagers are trying to survive amidst this terrible plague, this Red Death, Prospero continues to live in comfort in his castle, where he basically treats his servants with similar disdain. Now, even those who are lucky enough to find a safe haven in Prospero's castle are still subject to his whims, and they include a tendency for him to mock and belittle his subjects, all for his pure entertainment. Throughout the film, Prospero expresses his contempt for Christianity. Instead, he praises Satan, makes it clear that he is a devout worshiper of the devil. So this is clearly not a good guy. He has really has no redeeming values whatsoever. This role, Prince Prospero, was one of those roles that was absolutely made for Vincent Price. He plays this despicable character with lots of gusto, and as usual, Price is able to do his best in making his character despicable and unlikable really across the board. There's no way that you can come out of this movie liking Prospero, feeling sorry for him at any point in time. Price is fantastic. He carries the ball, as I'm sure Corman asked him to do. But the film also stars some other very good actors. You had a longtime English actor, Patrick Magee, also Hazel Court, and Jane Asher. Jane Asher at the time was the girlfriend of Paul McCartney, the young lead singer for the Beatles, who were just starting to gain fame right around this time, 1964. And apparently Asher brought McCartney to the set, introduced him to Roger Corman. Corman said he'd never heard of McCartney, but was polite to him. You know, he treated him well, but he was like, I really don't know who you are, so I can't make a huge deal out of you. So that was kind of interesting at the time. All these actors, Asher, Court, Magee, they all thrive under the direction of Roger Corman. Magee was a very interesting guy. He was really a hard-drinking character actor, and he had one of those faces that just embodied the word sinister. I mean, he looked like kind of an angry guy, and he looked like an evil guy, even if he was playing characters totally opposite of that. And here in The Masque of the Red Death, he gives one of his typically devious performances. At first, he is one of Prospero's very faithful servants, but then his situation kind of changes near the end of the film as Prospero pulls a fast one on him. Anyway, the four principal actors, they all perform very well for Corman here. They do justice to a very good script written by pretty famous writer Charles Beaumont. He was a guy that did a lot of the scripts for The Twilight Zone and did a lot of television writing, really outstanding. He sadly died very young in the late 1960s, but a really talented guy. So those are some initial thoughts on this film, 1964, The Masque of the Red Death. Tracy, let's get some of your thoughts on this vintage film.
Oh, my goodness. Again, it's another movie that I had never seen before. So I put it on last night and took a watch. I'm a big fan of Vincent Price, so I was really interested to see this movie, see what it was all about. And given that Roger Corman had recently passed away, it's kind of good to explore some of his works, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I noticed was how vivid this movie was. And, it was beautiful. Like, it was beautifully shot. The rooms in the castle were just gorgeous. The colors were crisp and saturated. I noticed like the reds and the blues and the greens. And I don't know, Bruce, if I watched a restored copy of this movie or if that is how it was originally shot. It was so vivid. It was beautiful. I mean, for a movie made in 1964, it was psychedelic and trippy and kind of reminded me a little bit of one of Ansel Farage's movies, Todd Tarantula, just that like weird, trippy type thing. So I thought that was kind of cool, because I'm not really used to seeing something like that. But not being overly familiar with this movie, I now get the reference from Mike Flanagan's The Fall of the House of Usher and the scene with Prospero's masquerade party and the warehouse.
Yeah.
And, a couple of tiebacks to like Poe's writings. So from my standpoint, I thought that was pretty darn cool to kind of like put all of that together. So I really enjoyed it for that part. I thought it was a great story. There's like a couple of scenes where I think it's a little bit outdated and, a couple of those things probably wouldn't go over very well today, but it's a product of the era, of course, because it's 1964.
Yeah. What's an example of that?
So one of the things that I found was a little quirky was the little ballerina. I know she was meant to be an older lady, but it wasn't. But they did do a good job. Like, they dubbed her voice. I just thought it was a little bit strange.
Yeah.
Like, I thought that part was a little bit strange. But I mean, Vincent Price did an excellent job. I'm such a huge fan of his. He was like his normal calm and spooky self that he usually is. And one thing that I found was weird, Bruce, is like he gives the impression that everything that is happening is like normal. And, devil worshiping is a normal thing to talk about. And it was like an accepted practice. So it was so weird in that way, but it was kind of fun at the same time.
Yeah.
And I would love to know what it would have been like to watch this movie back when it first aired. Like, was it a theatrical release? Was it something that was on TV? Like, do you know how it was originally broadcast?
Well, it originally did go to theaters.
Okay.
I can't remember if it started in Great Britain and then went to the US or vice versa, but it was definitely a theatrical release.
Okay.
And then I remember seeing it, I think by the 1970s on television. So it was something that, went into syndication a few years later. But no, it definitely started in theaters. Absolutely.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I'm going to have to go back and kind of like read some of the comments that maybe people might have thought, like if they watched it back in the theater days. I would just be curious to see what their thoughts would have been on it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you mentioned the Fall of the House of Usher, Mike Flanagan series, which aired over the winter. And that episode when they were having like the dance rave in the warehouse, that was a nod to this.
Yes, absolutely.
And I thought that was probably the best episode of that series. The way that ended, right? Was unbelievable. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I know. And just to kind of see it played out kind of in the Masque of the Red Death, it was interesting. It made me want to watch Mike Flanagan's series again, just to kind of watch that one scene and kind of put the two side by side. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was just a crazy episode. I thought that was probably the peak of Fall of the House of Usher with Mike Flanagan. That was a very powerful conclusion to that episode. Let's pick up on one of the points you mentioned about the colors that we saw. I don't know if you saw a restoration. I saw this film back in the 70s and 80s, and I've always remembered it for the bright colors. So I think that's always been there. Corman really wanted to create kind of a visual tapestry, powerful, lasting, and he certainly did here. There's lots of bright colors, especially red. And that, of course, is appropriate for a guy who is involved with satanic worship. So that really contributes to the film. It really did have kind of a psychedelic feel. It almost had the feel of a 1970s movie as opposed to an early 1960s film. So I think you're right on in making that observation about the color schemes. And I don't know how he did it. He didn't have a lot of money, but he was always able to overachieve with these films, low budgets, and yet the films always looked better than you think they should have. A lot of times it was obvious that he was doing them on indoor sets, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of natural outdoor scenery. And sometimes that can be a little disappointing watching a movie. It doesn't feel authentic. But I think in this case, in Masque of the Red Death, it works. And I think it's those colors and that tapestry, that feel that really succeeds here in this movie. So that's a great observation that you made there. Now, interesting, Tracy, as a cost-cutting move, Corman actually decided to move filming of The Masque of the Red Death to England. Prior to this, he had done all of his films in the United States. But he decided he was going to take advantage of the tax situation, which was far more favorable in Great Britain than in America. So with tax breaks, that helped him get this done in a cheaper way. He also took additional advantage of the situation by using some pre-existing sets that had been used on another film, not a horror film, Beckett. And that was a film that was done earlier in 1964. Corman loved to use pre-existing sets because, again, save money, save time. And in this case, the sets worked, even though Beckett is obviously a very different film than Masque of the Red Death. So this was the first time that Corman ever went to England to make a movie. And it's a decision that really turned out to be a fruitful one for him. The climactic scene for Masque of the Red Death is really good. It's this lavish masquerade party at Prospero's castle, and the way it's done is particularly striking. It's interesting, though, Tracy, Corman himself felt disappointed by the final scene. He was rushed to get it done. I guess the producers said, "Hey, we need you to get this done within like a day." And this would normally be a scene that you might take several days because it's a long scene. There's lots of things that go on. But he had to basically get it done that same day. He felt, Corman, that he could have done better with additional time. But again, he made the most of the situation. The scene is highly effective and certainly more than capable of creating memorable twist ending to the movie. And then following the masquerade scene, there's a kind of a brief scene that's the conclusion to the film. It's a little bit bizarre, highly metaphorical. Doesn't detract, though, at all from the overall story. If anything, it makes the viewer consider the story on a grander scale within a wider context. So I think it works. I think it's effective. As we mentioned before, this was a film produced by American International Pictures, AIP. They did lots of horror movies in the 60s and 70s, and they did these Poe films that Corman was involved with. Masque of the Red Death offers really an intriguing storyline. It is executed artistically, despite the obvious budgetary limits that Corman faced. Some have criticized it because maybe it's not that scary. It doesn't have this major fear factor, but it is an example of a more subtle horror film that is achieved through the development of characters and that very powerful visual imagery we talked about earlier. In my mind, there's no question the Masque of the Red Death is one of his best. It's my favorite. It's really an example of how a fine film can be made with minimal outlay of money, thanks to a good story, solid acting, which we certainly have here, and very judicious choices by a veteran director who had started directing in the 50s and by the 60s had really kind of mastered what he was doing. So I really love this one. 3.5 stars for The Masque of the Red Death. Tracy, what rating would you give this film from Corman?
Oh my goodness. I thought long and hard about this one. I mean, I thought the movie was pretty good and definitely worth watching. Like you mentioned, like I didn't find it scary, and I don't know if I would classify it as like a horror flick. It's a psychological type thriller, and satanic worshiping is like it's a terrifying subject matter. So it's like one of those psychological horror type movies, I guess. Yeah. I'm definitely not used to watching a movie like this. And, I think I would give it 3 stars. I mean, I need to go back and watch it again and kind of pick up on some of the symbolism that I missed the first time. Because like I think there's so much story there, and it happens quite quickly. There's like little side stories and stuff like that. So I think watching it one time isn't enough. It's worth like another viewing just to put everything together again. So, again, 3 for me for now, but that could definitely change.
It's interesting because when I first saw this movie and I reviewed it for the Ghostly Gallery Facebook page, I think initially I gave it 3 stars. But in watching it since then, I do grow to appreciate it more. And I've elevated from 3 to 3.5. And I think it's that kind of movie that, some movies, you can see it once, you kind of know everything that's there, everything's on the surface, it's pretty easy to digest. This is one of those movies I think you need to see more than one time. And really, the test of a movie, good movie, does it get better with future viewings? And I think it does.
Exactly. Oh, exactly. I couldn't have said that better. Like that is so true, Bruce. There's always like those handful of movies that, you have to watch a second time just to kind of get that feel for, what the director and the writer was trying to present to its audience, right? And for me, this is one of those movies. There's so much to it, and I'll have to watch it again soon. I don't want to go too long in between not seeing it again.
So 3 stars from Tracy, 3.5 stars from me for one of Roger Corman's best films, The Masque of the Red Death. And I think from time to time during 2024, I'd like to revisit some of Corman's films as a tribute. Again, we lost him earlier in the month at the age of 98. One of the most prolific and influential horror directors and producers, a guy that gave a lot of young actors and actresses a chance when maybe nobody else was willing to do so. He hired a young Jack Nicholson to work on The Terror with Boris Karloff. And that's just one of many examples of Corman seeing something in a young talent, giving that person a chance. And then eventually that person goes on to even bigger and better things. An extremely important person in the context and history of horror films. Late, great Roger Corman. All right, Tracy, next up is a film that is completely different, no connection to Roger Corman, but certainly is timely because it just went into theaters recently and now is starting to become available on streaming. So it's the 2024 release, Abigail. And it's about a group of 6 professional criminals. They are hired to kidnap a 12-year-old girl who is a brilliant ballerina dancer. She's also the daughter of a wealthy man who is otherwise unknown to the kidnappers. Now, the only reason that they know that the man is wealthy is because the guy who has organized this group of criminals has told them they're going to ask for, I think, $50 million in ransom money. So they don't know what his background is. They just know that he's got lots of cash, and they feel like, well, he's probably going to give it up for his daughter, right? So they end up kidnapping her from the mansion that she lives in. They then take her to another large mansion, which we don't really know where it is. And that's where they meet up with their boss, who basically tells them, keep this young girl under wraps for the next 24 hours. That'll give us time to make the ransom offer, prepare it for the girl's father, and hopefully he'll agree to pay the ransom within that span of 24 hours. Now, it's no big surprise that this young ballerina is actually a vampire. It's a twist, but the way the film was promoted, you know that's going to happen. You're just kind of waiting for her to show that, yeah, she is actually a creature of the undead. When we officially learn that that is the case, and more importantly, when the kidnappers realize that, yeah, she is a vampire with supernatural powers, well, now they realize they've entered an extremely dangerous situation. This is not a simple kidnapping, if there ever is such a thing. But there is an additional twist beyond that. We're not going to reveal that here. We don't want to spoil it. But there's an additional twist beyond her identity as a vampire. And that twist really throws these 6 kidnappers into this boiling pot of violence, mayhem, and death. I mean, it's a worst case scenario that develops in every way. Now, Tracy, going into the film, I really had expected something very different. I hadn't done a lot of reading about the movie, although I'd heard pretty positive reviews. People talked about it was shocking, gory, kind of a bloodbath. But I didn't do a lot of research into it. I just want to kind of go in fresh and watch it. So when it begins, the first 20 minutes or so really start out as something of an action thriller film. These kidnappers, go through their plan of taking captive of the young girl, getting her out of her house, taking her to this remote mansion. And it's really not until the girl's vampiric ways are revealed that it starts to take on the feel of a horror movie. So at that point, it does become a horror film. But what I was not expecting is that it's one that is speckled with lots of moments of comedy, principally through really outlandish dialogue by the kidnappers and some over-the-top scenarios that are presented on screen. So I was not expecting any comical aspect. Looking at it on IMDb, I think it basically said it was a horror film, didn't say anything about comedy. So that was a bit of a surprise. It's not an overwhelming amount of comedy. It's kind of done in fits and bursts here and there. But it's obvious that it's intentional. That's what the director wanted, to intersperse the horror with humor. I really had expected going in, Tracy, more of a serious and somber horror movie, but it was very different from that. It was more of an action-packed bloodbath with remarkably violent kills, explosions of blood all over the place, and perhaps the most terrifying 12-year-old vampire that one could ever imagine seeing on screen. We're going to talk more about this actress in a moment who played Abigail. She's unbelievable in what she's able to do. So, Tracy, those are some of my initial thoughts on the film Abigail. What are yours?
Oh, gosh. I don't even know where to start with this one, Bruce. Like you mentioned, this movie was just released on streaming services after being at the theater. I think it debuted, I want to say, in April. And now it just started, I think, this past weekend on streaming. Again, I put this on last night to have a watch. And, I didn't do any preparation work either for, before I watched this film. I did see the trailer. And, honestly, I wasn't totally impressed with the trailer. It was a little bit different, and I didn't really know how the idea of this little dancing ballerina could be a vampire. So I wasn't sure how that was going to work out.
Now, you see,
but I really wanted.
I didn't even see the trailer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What's the trailer like? I didn't see it at all.
Well, so the trailer is like 2.5 minutes, and it basically tells you exactly what's going to happen in the film, like the 2.5 minutes. So I think they gave way too much away in that trailer. It didn't leave a lot of suspense. But I really wanted to see this movie because Kevin Durant was in it. And, I love this guy, from, he played Fett the Exterminator in one of my favorite TV shows. He's an awesome actor. He's so solid. So that was the biggest reason why I wanted to really see this movie. But like I mentioned, the trailer gave so much away. I think they should have held back a little bit. But it's kind of cool. Like it's kind of cool. I mean, for my initial thoughts, I was curious to see how this little girl who was so innocent could become this vampire. I think there's just so much that they have the possibility to do with this story. So I think I'll leave it there for right now.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of the individual performances. And Tracy will begin with the 14-year-old actress Alicia Weir. She plays the title character of Abigail. I wasn't that familiar with her going into this. At times, she plays Abigail delicate, innocent, begging her captors to be lenient, begging them to have some compassion. Then she gives a little bit of a hint to one of her captors when she says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I'm sorry about what's going to happen to you." And it's very ominous. And that's where we start to get a hint that, well, we know that she's going to turn into a vampire and she's going to show that character. But it also gives you a little bit of a sense of how sinister she really is. And then not that long after that little hint, he does unveil her true nature as a vicious, cold-blooded killer, vampire without remorse, one who is hell-bent on tormenting her kidnappers before ultimately bringing their lives to an end. So if you felt sorry for her at all toward the beginning of the film, they show her practicing in the theater. They show her getting into the limo with her driver, coming to the house. They show her when she's kidnapped initially. And, she's very innocent and charming, and you don't get any sense of what's really going on here. And then it really, it kind of changes. She's very believable, though, in both ways, I think. She shows both sides of her personality, and they both come across as believable, which is a tribute to this 14-year-old girl's ability to act. I mean, it's really an amazing effort for anybody, but especially for a youngster who's essentially a teenager. Cannot be easy either to be so frightening while wearing a ballerina's dress. I mean, that's one of the really striking things about this movie. I mean, you think of something that is completely the opposite of frightening or intimidating, the outfit that a ballerina wears, and for Weir to pull it off as this scary character, genuinely frightening, it's remarkable. I mean, this kid has amazing talent, really. So she's great in the lead role, and that helps a lot. Another really great performer is a veteran actor, Dan Stevens, who has been doing movies for a number of years. I believe at one point he actually did a Dracula movie where he played the Count. I think he's a good actor, underrated actor. And here he plays the character that's named Frank, the leader of the gang of kidnappers. Now, we should mention that all of the kidnappers are given phony names by their leader because he doesn't want anybody to be able to identify other kidnappers if they get caught. So he gives them all phony names, and they're members of the Rat Pack. Frank, of course, Frank Sinatra. So Dan Stevens plays Frank, quote unquote, the leader of the gang. He is on the surface a tough talking street type, but really that masks the fact that he's kind of a coward. More than kind of, he really is a coward. He shows his true colors whenever things don't go well. And he's also someone who is only too willing to betray his fellow criminals as long as he gets something out of it, as long as he emerges unscathed. So he's really kind of a dastardly guy in many ways. And he's excellent in the role. You can kind of tell he has a lot of fun with this movie, the accent that he takes on, the way that it behaves. He's over the top, but it's effective in the way that he does it. And then there is an actress, Melissa Barrera, who, by the way, starred in the 2 most recent Scream films. So a lot of fans listening to this might be familiar with her. So she plays the character named Joey. And she is the only one of the 6 kidnappers that really has any kind of a moral compass at all. In addition to being the kidnapper that is assigned to kind of be kind to Abigail, gain her trust, she is also the smartest of the group. I mean, she might have been the youngest, but she's the smartest. And really, I think probably the only one of the 6 criminals that you might actually find yourself rooting for, especially as we get deeper and deeper into the movie. So I thought she was very good too. So Barrera, Stevens, Weir, all terrific in playing their parts. Now, you mentioned Kevin Durand a moment ago, and for me, this was the big disappointment of the film, and I want to get your thoughts on this. It's the character that Durand played. This guy was so good in The Strain. He was great in a film that is kind of underrated, Dark Was the Night. He plays the hero, the protagonist in that. He's an excellent actor. But in this film, he is given the role, he is called Peter. He is really a 270-pound lunk who is arguably the dumbest of the 6 kidnappers and is given some of the most idiotic lines in the film. And as he's giving these lines, I'm thinking, I mean, this is the best they could come up with for him. This is such a good actor. And a guy, if you give him the right lines, really can shine. He deserved a much better role than what he was apparently forced to do in this film. And I guess, if you're told to play a 270-pound lunk, that's what you have to do. I was really disappointed by that. I don't know what the director was thinking about. Kevin Durand is capable of so much better. And for me, this performance just, he had no shot with what he was given. I know you're a big fan of his. You mentioned that earlier. What did you think of his character?
Oh my gosh. I think there was an opportunity to do something way better with his character, just like you mentioned. I mean, I know that Kevin, he has a sense of humor and he provides comedic relief in this film. But to me, it felt off. And, I just don't think that they did enough for him. I was really disheartened by his role. And don't get me wrong, he performed well. He did the best he could do with the information basically that he was given. And, I felt that he was underutilized. And I don't want to use this word disrespected, but I felt that he was disrespected in a way because he is so talented. And, I mean, if they were going to give him a role like this, they might want to had looked at a different actor to take on that and maybe even given him the role of Frank.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
I think he would have been a great Frank. That's all I could think about in this movie. So, I do love this actor. I think he's fantastic in everything that he's in. I think his role could have been different. And, I do look forward to other things that he's going to be in the future. So I just kind of have to set this one aside and just say, you know.
Well, you look at his character of Fett in The Strain. And at first, the impression that he creates is, he's this blowhard who has all this kind of worthless information about the history of New York. And you don't think he's particularly bright, and you think he's maybe a little bit on the evil side. But throughout the series, as the series develops, you actually find out he's very smart, he's very ingenious, and that
Mm,
the way that he speaks kind of masks just how intelligent he is.
that's
But in
right.
this movie, he's not intelligent. He's stupid. And that's the way
Well,
they wanted him to be. And I think that was the wrong choice.
no, I totally agree. And I think they kind of pushed the envelope just a little bit too far in two circumstances. I mean, they kind of, when they kind of mocked him for being like, a French guy from Quebec, like that was a little bit odd. Yes, he is French and he is from Quebec, but, you know, it was just weird. And then the drawing that one of the characters put on his face was, I just don't think that they really needed to put that into the movie either.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of, a
Cheap.
non-point.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I think he was very underutilized and, you know, his next project will be a lot better, whatever that might be. So,
Tracy, one
yeah,
other question I wanted to ask you about Kevin Durand here. It looked to me like he was a lot heavier. I guess they wanted him to be kind of the muscle man, the
mhm.
intimidator. Um, they said they refer to him as 270 pounds in the film, and he might have
Mhm.
been that weight. He looked a lot heavier here than in the Strain. Did you agree
Yeah,
with that?
oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. I do follow his account on Instagram and like he's like working out like crazy and he definitely I think he bulked. I don't know if he bulked up for this role or if there's another role that he might be involved in. But definitely definitely a lot larger than in The Strain.
yeah.
And I mean, I guess like time too, but I feel he's probably, it's a lot of working out just to kind of bulk up for possibly this role.
And he was no 18-pound weakling in the Strain. I mean, the body that he had
Oh goodness.
there, that physique would have worked perfectly for this role. I don't think they needed to add to it.
No.
His face looked kind of puffed up. He didn't look like the Kevin Durand that I've come to know in films over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and he's super tall too. I want to
Yeah.
say he's like 6'2", maybe 6'3". Like he's super tall. He towered over the rest of the cast there.
Yeah. So that part of the film was disappointing for both of us. I'll tell you the one thing, Tracy, I thought was really good was the mansion that they used for the majority of the film. I mean, 90% of the film takes place in this mansion. Apparently, it's the Guinness Manor in Dublin, so it's a real life location. And it's beautiful. It has a Gothic feel to it, and it's enormous. It has a dramatic staircase and a dramatic lobby. I thought it provides a great backdrop for a vampire film. The lavish interiors really establish a Gothic feel to this movie, Abigail. In addition, I thought the special effects that were used were also top notch. So I think that's a real strength. One other point I want to make before we kind of give final assessments of this movie, the film was actually filmed under the working title of Dracula's Daughter. And this is no coincidence because it is a very loose remake of the 1936 film Dracula's Daughter, which starred Gloria Holden as Countess Maria Zaleska, the offspring of Dracula. So this is a follow-up to the Bela Lugosi Dracula of 1931. Lugosi was not in the movie, though at one point it seemed like he would be. So the focus is on the daughter, played by Gloria Holden, who does a great job in the film. Now, let's emphasize one thing. This is a very, very loose remake of the movie. Some critics have made a big deal about the connection here. And I think maybe it's a bit exaggerated because while that was certainly an influence and something that they were motivated by, let's be honest. This movie and Dracula's Daughter really are not that similar. Abigail, the character, is essentially the daughter of Dracula, although that name is never used, but it's implied. She's a child. She looks nothing like Gloria Holden, who was an adult actress at the time of filming for Dracula's Daughter. The film is nothing like the 1936 movie. The story is completely different. The look is completely different. I mean, that was a black and white film with no bloodshed, very little violence. Uh, Obviously, Abigail is an extremely violent movie. So that's light years difference between this movie and what Universal Studios gave us in 1936. Yeah, there's a connection, there's an influence there, but I wouldn't make that much of it because they're just so far different. I mean, it really, I think, is a point that needs to be made. I'll say this, all in all, I found Abigail to be an entertaining movie, kind of a thrill ride, kept my attention throughout. I was curious to, see what was going to happen next. I was kind of curious for the big reveal at the end, which ends up happening. Ideally, though, I would have preferred really a deeper examination of the connection between Abigail and her father. We do learn that he's some sort of a mob boss. We learn his name, but we don't know that much about him. They don't really explore the whole Dracula thing, even though it's implied. I thought it would be interesting to get deeper into that backstory, maybe even do a flashback, but they never do anything like that. Mm-hmm. I also would have preferred far less bloodletting in a movie. Now, I'm not shy about horror movies. I've watched R-rated horror movies. I've watched NC-17 films. A little bit of blood here and there, some violence I can accept. But I do think this one went kind of over and above. And even in reading about the movie, I read actually just a few things today about it because I didn't want to read this going in. But a lot of the actors in the film, they were surprised at how much bloodshed there was. I mean, there were a couple of times when characters literally exploded into blood. It's everywhere. And it gets onto everybody's face and into their skin. I just thought, you didn't need to do that much. I mean, this was overdone. They used to criticize Texas Chainsaw Massacre for being overly violent. Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't really show the violence as it's taking place. They pull away. It's suggested. It's hinted at. But they kind of leave it up to your imagination. They didn't leave anything up to your imagination here. So I just thought that was a bit overdone. I'm not one of those horror fans who goes in and, is rooting for more bloodshed, the better, more buckets of blood. That's not my way. That to me does not make for a great horror movie. And I think it was so overdone here, it really does detract from the film. All in all, I think it's good. I think it's worth watching, but I wouldn't call it great. I wouldn't agree with the consensus of many of the reviews, which have been, rave reviews praising this movie. It's good. It's not great. It's not a classic. I'll give it 3 stars, which I think is solid. It's certainly entertaining and worth looking at. Beyond that, though, it's not a film that I think I would revisit time and time again. So 3 stars from me. What do you think, Tracy?
Oh, my goodness. Well, first of all, Bruce, I like your term buckets of blood. I think I'm going to start amalgamating that into my everyday lingo.
Yeah.
So I love that. Alicia Weir, who plays Abigail, again, like you say, she did so excellent in this film. Sweet and innocent, and her in that little white tutu, you would never believe that there was a monster inside that little girl. I just thought it was an interesting idea. I felt I had a chance to do a lot more with this story. I kind of felt a little bit disjointed. I don't want to say this film was, trying to follow along with the same type of genre idea of a horror movie using a kid as a monster. And I say that because, we just had the movie, what was it called? Megan.
Megan, yeah.
So Megan, it was just released, I think, a couple of years ago. And then the one that we just watched not long ago, Late Night with the Devil, with the possessed girl.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if they were trying to kind of capitalize on something like that it was kind of weird. The twist at the end, which I'm not going to say, was interesting. I wasn't overly familiar with these characters either, Bruce. Like Melissa Barrera that you mentioned. I didn't know she played in Scream because I'm not a big fan of that franchise. Catherine Newton, who played the techie girl, she was in Lisa Frankenstein. She played the lead. I haven't seen that movie yet either. But the other actors like Dan Stevens, William Catlett, the late Angus Cloud and Giancarlo Esposito, they were all really, really great. They played their parts excellent. Granted, they were very stereotypical parts, you know, and over the top. And, you know, I think this movie, honestly, and I know I say this all the time, it could have been 90 minutes rather than the hour and 50 minutes that it played out to be. It was a little bit long. I feel it was lower budget. And again, just choppy. And my disappointment with what they did with Kevin Durant's character, it just kind of made me give it a 2 stars.
Okay.
No real jump scares, really. I didn't feel lots of blood and guts and exploding bodies. Yes. I think it's a good teenager horror flick, I guess, for those guys to go to the theater with their friends to see, like entry level. Me personally, I saved theater dollars and popcorn coin by streaming this one at home. It's just not my cup of coffee, actually. Just kind of disappointed. I didn't have huge high expectations anyway, but yeah, unfortunately, I really do have to give this a 2 stars.
Well, I think that's fair, you know, based on your assessment, and you're kind of in agreement with what I've said about the film.
Yeah.
I did find it entertaining, and it kept me motivated to keep watching. At no point did I say I'm going to just shut this off. I kept going. But yeah, it's not for everybody. I mean, if you're someone who's not into blood-soaked gore, start to finish, this is not going to appeal to you. And I think you're right. It does appeal more to the teenage, younger audience. And I think that was what they're gunning for here, as opposed to, you know, someone your age, relatively young, but not a teenager, or someone my age, relatively old, but not a teenager. And
oh my goodness,
we're not the right market for it. I do want to pick up on one thing. You mentioned the late actor Angus Cloud. He died after doing his scenes. I don't think it's giving away much that his character is killed off first.
Yeah.
But he actually passed away. He, I think, suffered a drug overdose. They had already filmed all of his scenes, and so they were able to incorporate all of that. But he died actually in the early part of the production process. Young guy, he was only like 25, had some talent, and sadly another victim to drug abuse. And we've seen too much of that in Hollywood and music for many years now. But the movie was obviously dedicated to his memory. He's the first character to be killed off. I don't want to say much beyond that as far as other characters. But at least we can take away some really good performances here. Again, Alicia Weir, Dan Stevens, Melissa Barrera. These are some talents. I mean, Stevens is established, Barrera and Weir much younger, but I think there's good things in store for them in the future. Some real talents, and that's a nice thing to take from it.
Absolutely. I think, you know, everybody had their great performances, and I think there's so much more in the future for those guys too. I mean, Alicia Weir, she's had some really good roles in her young life. She's 14. I think she might have been 12 when this movie was put out. But yeah, she starred in, I think, the film Matilda and a couple other, you know, well-known movies. So I think she has a huge career out on that horizon. I mean, she's got talent.
Yeah. We were both impressed by the young actress that you mentioned in Late Night with the Devil. Also a child actress. I forget her name. It's not coming to my mind right now. Who do you think performed their role better? Do you think she did, or do you think Alicia Weir did in Abigail?
Oh my gosh. That is so hard because they both put on such a great performance in different ways. Man, that's a difficult question, Bruce.
I think they probably were both
actually.
equally good. The other actress has the benefit of being in a better movie.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Alicia, like that really was her dancing in the ballet. Like she's a professional dancer.
Right.
And she's also a singer as well. So she has that talented. And I did read that the directors purposely put a little more ballet moves into this movie because they wanted to accentuate her natural talent.
Yeah.
So, as the killings progress, there's more ballet moves. So who knew? Who would have thought that you could actually put ballet and murder and exploding bodies all into one movie? Kind of interesting.
And that part of it fit. The way that was choreographed and the way that tied in with some of the killing, that actually was part of the film that really made a lot of sense to me, that they would do that.
Oh, yes. Well, the one scene that's really interesting when she first kind of makes an appearance that she is a vampire and she starts with her arms and starts to do the ballet moves. I was like, well, that's an interesting take. It was really quite good, actually. Yeah. So, it had that scene going for it. And just when, to give it away just a teeny little bit, when they turned another character into the same type of like puppet creature, they made her do ballet moves as well, which I thought was interesting. So, yeah, again, interesting. Ballet and vampirism.
I believe the actress I was referring to in Late Night with the Devil is Ingrid Torelli, by the way.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right. It is. Yeah. And she's 18 and she's Australian. She was phenomenal in that film.
Yeah, she did a great job. And Alicia Weir did a great job too in Abigail, even though overall we did find it a little bit on the disappointing side. So just to review our two films, for Abigail, I was generous in giving it 3 stars. Tracy was probably more accurate in giving it only 2 stars. And then we're both fans of the classic film from the late Roger Corman, Masque of the Red Death from 1964. Tracy gave it 3 stars, gave it 3.5. So those are the 2 films we reviewed this week. Our 40th episode of the Ghostly Gallery podcast is just about in the books. Well, Tracy, as always, I want to thank you for joining us over this past hour. Great job. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Bruce. This again was excellent. And I am now inspired to revisit and learn more about Roger Corman movies. So thank you for that.
Yeah, we'll have to do some more Corman as 2024 continues. We thank Tracy. We thank all of the faithful listeners as well for joining us in this Museum of the Macabre. And we hope we'll see you again next time, right here in the Ghostly Gallery.